everybody. We're going to get started. This is our state legislation work session. We have a handy-dandy packet that was prepared by Ms. Amanda Myhill. And of course, we have Ms. Wanger here with her team. Today we have 6 bills to review and then some additional updates as well. So let's get started.
Okay. So just as far as kind of a what's going on with the 2019 session update, a couple of things. That's why we have a first bullet here, kind of one of the obviously major issues that it's going to exist for quite a while. I think has been around for quite a while and will continue to be a focal point, not just for Montgomery County, but every other county and the entire state of Maryland, is the Kerwin Commission. So Mr. Rice is a member of that commission, so I'm certain that he will have some things to add. But the commission did finalize its work. It finalized its recommendations. Those recommendations in the report, which will be something that we'll make sure you get copies of. It's probably down in the print shop right now, and there is a piece of legislation in drafting. And that piece of legislation will likely be kind of the backbone of those recommendations. It may speak to the $236 million that is available for FY20 to spend on this initiative, and it may also speak to a commitment to at least FY20 funding, but I don't know all the details of it, so as soon as it comes out, we'll know what that piece of legislation looks like. In your packet, let's see, where are these circles? Somewhere? Okay. In the Circle 1 shows the denomination of the recommendations. It's about a $3.1 billion package that the commission contemplated over a period of time. And they worked through 5 work groups, of which Mr. Rice was the chair of the Early Childhood Education Work Group. And so those 5 work groups are listed on the far left-hand side, and it shows the value of the recommendations, the cost of recommendations that they had developed through an extensive effort over the summer and into the fall, and actually as early as just last week or 2 weeks ago. Circle 2 shows what they have recommended for the FY20 budget. There is money that of sorts is set aside, about $325 million, in our previous discussion about the public school construction administration package. That piece of legislation does spend some of the $125 million for FY20. I think it leaves about $36 million for the Kerwin recommendations or left over for this piece. So you'd be looking at, if things stay as they are today, about $236 million as a kind of a down payment this year in the categories that are listed on the second bullet. Don't know much about what the local requirement might be for these funding streams, if they would require matches, if they would be run through a wealth equalized formula. So I think, again, as we get a little deeper into the session and these conversations become more focused, we'll be back to you with a lot more information about this. So I think that's Kerwin kind of in a 50,000-foot level. And we can also go on to public school construction, unless there's any questions.
There's a light. Councilman Albornoz. Is it? Oh, it says Friedson. So which one is it? It's you. It's Councilmember Rice. It's different names on the little thingy here.
And he uses them different names depending on where he is.
Is that what it
That's
is?
exactly right.
I'm
That's
happy
exactly
to
right.
be mistaken for my colleague and friend.
And vice
He's got a
versa,
better
I'm sure.
sport coat on.
So let me just chime in about the Kerwin Commission recommendations, because it's very interesting over the course of this session. This education trust fund money, as we would expect, is starting to be spread very thinly across a number of different priorities. As Mel pointed out, she's going to be talking about school construction, and there's already a bill that's been introduced by the governor to utilize $125 million from the Education Trust Fund to actually fund that initiative, but this money is only the money that's in there, and so therefore can't be spent multiple times. And so is it going to go for Kerwin operating expenses via the $325 million that we have, or is the governor going to say that it should go for capital expense? And so from that perspective, there's a bit of a challenge that's out there. I think that one of the things that is incredibly important for us as a locality is that this initial funding priority, this $325 million, does not have a local share. And so that initial down payment on these recommendations was tied to it not having any local contribution to help jumpstart a lot of our jurisdictions throughout the state. And so from that perspective, again, it'll be how the bill is drafted, but that was the Commission's recommendations. Now, when it comes to the other future recommendations, there had been talk about 50-50 split, 60-40 split. You know, who knows what those numbers will end up being, but certainly somewhere around there probably is likely, which will make it, quite honestly, unaffordable for a lot of jurisdictions. A lot of jurisdictions can't afford to do a 50-50 split when it comes to a lot of these recommendations that we have. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out and how the funding formulas, whether or not they're equated to the local wealth formulas and attached to those as well, what the weights will be, and you know, we have our recommendations, but again, it's all up to the General Assembly in terms of putting that in a bill. So I wanted to put that out there because I know, Madam President, that you've been focused on really trying to put a down payment on early childhood education. And so if we do get this down payment on Kerwin Commission recommendations, there will be funding specifically when it comes to expansion of pre-K that will flow to jurisdictions. Keep in mind, there are a lot of jurisdictions who are already doing this. And so from that perspective, we become a priority as not having the ability to do this for all of our kids right now. And so I'm hopeful that we'll see some money flowing from the state, should they fund the Kerwin Commission recommendations, that would come to Montgomery County to help in that effort. So, you know, our fingers are certainly crossed there. And Mel?
I just do want to make you aware of one technicality on the $200 million that's been set aside.
Yep,
Governor doesn't have to bring that down,
that's right.
okay? So, FYI.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot about political pressure.
Right. So,
Absolutely.
Right, he has to recognize that and spend it. I mean, there are tactics that can be brought to bear, but it is not a requirement that he do that as it's currently written, so.
Well, thank you for that update, and also Councilmember Rice, thank you so much for everything that you continue to do to represent us so well, especially in this space of early childhood. It's going to take all these different components for us here in Montgomery County to begin to address this challenge. And so, you know, Kerwin and whatever comes out of there is going to play an important role, and we really appreciate you being there to amplify that voice and that need for us. So we'll continue to monitor this as well. Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you so much, Council President. Wanted to just continue to ask about the early childhood funding. So this says, and Craig, you may know more than probably anyone in the room here, but we'll see. So the recommendation is to expand full-day pre-K funding to include all 4-year-olds being served. Does that mean that the state would move to pay for all 4-year-olds that are being served, or does that mean something different?
No, that's exactly what it means, but ultimately, in its true form, it would be a shared split model between the state and locals. This is to jumpstart that effort.
The split is unwritten
Exactly.
in that paragraph that we see.
That's
It's
correct.
funding to actualize
That's right.
this goal.
That's exactly right. And so the idea with this initial $29 million is to start laying the groundwork when it comes to hiring of teachers, when it comes to preparing some of the programmatic things that are required, because not only as a part of being eligible for funds, you also have to be Excels rated. And so all of those kinds of things go into that as well. So bringing people up to the Excel's level, that's encompassed in this money. There's a whole bunch of things that are eligible to be expended. It's in how they draft this bill as to what they're going to target. But those are all broad categories that are out there of how they could spend this money besides just additional slots. Now, again, with our private providers who most likely have the slots, that's kind of the quickest, easiest, dirtiest way for us to get this done. There is a lot more work when it comes to the elevation of some of our providers to be able to get themselves to the higher level of Excels and be able to offer that as well. And that's seen as a part of the larger context across the 10-year expansion period.
So would we be helping ourselves by increasing funding in our county budget towards this same goal of getting all 4-year-olds served in a full-day setting by public school systems?
I would say any jurisdiction throughout the state of Maryland should be starting to prepare themselves to meet.
Exactly. So you and I talked a couple months ago about trying to figure out how much would it cost us
Right.
to begin to implement the Kerwin model, because we think that the Kerwin model is what's going to be the state framework eventually.
That's right.
The policy work has been done by the commission. So, you know, to try to understand financially, what does it call upon us to do, and see how many steps we can take towards that this year in the budget. It ought to be, you know, what we ought to try to achieve, right?
Absolutely, and that's, from what I understand, what the council president has been laying out as a part of that initial plan, and I know you've been working on that as well, and so that's what I see as the next steps for us, is certainly preparing us, and that's what my message has been at MACO. At the MACO Winter Conference was, for those who are looking and seeking to get this additional funding from Kerwin, setting yourselves up now.
That helps those who helps themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, this is a very important year for us to really begin to build that capacity. And, you know, my goal as president is obviously to capitalize on everyone's expertise on this dais. And so we'll be having some more conversations about establishing leads, if you will, for every single of these components, because we do have to be ready, and it has to be intentional. And so there will be a lot of work in this space, and for sure, Kerwin is going to play, a pivotal role in us rolling out this year some tangibles. But really, the work is about setting us to build that capacity, so that when the money starts to flow, we're not scrambling to figure out what we're doing. We're ready to go. So there will be a lot going on. Okay.
I also wanted to add that, we prepared for the big negotiation to occur this year. So your Office of Legislative Oversight and Kathleen and me have been teaming for over a year now and preparing so that the county is capable of running its own funding scenarios and thoroughly understanding the impact of formula changes that are being discussed or formula changes that we would like to modify. So I think we're in a pretty good position, we're pretty well prepared for what looks like a year delay and what we anticipated would happen this year. So just a couple of other, unless there's other questions about that. Go ahead. Okay, just a couple other kind of housekeeping things as far as the 2019 session. Tonight is the filing deadline in the Senate. So by tomorrow morning, we should have the breadth of the work before us that's going to be in the Senate. And at the end of the week is the House filing deadline. So by the end of this week, we should pretty much have the major pieces of legislation before us. Anything that is dropped in the hopper or introduced after those deadlines has to go through additional procedural hurdles. Although I will say that the Kerwin bill could very well be one of those, and I think that will pass right on through any procedural hurdles and, be taken up, unlike some lesser pieces of legislation. Also, I wanted to mention to you that there is a different bond bill process this year that the legislature is implementing. At the end of the day, the result will be the same, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. But one thing that we're going to change in our office, and this is something that George Leventhal raised last year, after you all put your operating budget to bed, that on occasion, more than just on occasion, there will be nonprofits that pursued a state bond bill. And even though they didn't name the county as the grantee, when they submitted their quote-unquote fact sheets that described the project and all their revenue sources for the project to the state legislature, that potentially unbeknownst to you all, the county was named as a revenue source. So what we will do this year is we're reading every one of their fact sheets as they are submitted, and we will let you know if that has occurred, just so you're aware, and either you're already aware or you can have a conversation with a nonprofit or expect potentially to have a conversation with them about any of the details of what they've written in those documents. And that is it for where we stand with the 2019 session. And I think we can go right to the bill packet.
Before we start, I just also want to announce that for the Justification Bill, I know there have been some questions about if we were going to bring that up. I know Linda McMillan is working on a memo that should be circulated to council members today. So if you have further questions, just let her and Amanda know. I think that we need to send some type of position by Thursday, so if we can get everybody polled, by Wednesday morning, I guess would be a good time. That
Yeah,
would
the
be good.
sooner we have a sense, the better, so we
Yeah.
can make sure we understand it and answer any questions that work committee might have too before they actually take it up for what I would assume will be a vote on Thursday.
Okay. Excellent. All right, start.
Okay. Kathleen, do you have the first bill?
Yes, thank you. So moving on to the bills that are listed in Melanie's memo to the council, starting on memos on Circle A, is House Bill 79, and there's a description in the back of your packet on Circle 8. But essentially, this bill increases by 2 the number of early voting centers that Montgomery County must have. Right now, under current law, Montgomery County is required to have 11 early voting centers, and this bill would require it to have 2. The bill is actually drafted in a way that it's based on the number of registered voters in terms of how many early voting centers are needed or required in a county, but right now, the immediate impact of this bill is only on 4 counties. Montgomery County would require 2 new, Howard County, Calvert, and Charles, 1 new. The bill does have a fiscal impact on the county, and Margaret Jurgensen did put together a spreadsheet, which you should have in front of you, that does show the costs per election, and Margaret is here if you would like to discuss the fiscal impact. But she shows a cost of $144,000 essentially for the primary election and $105,000 for the general election in terms of the new mandated early voting centers. The MACO will be supporting this bill with an amendment to make it discretionary for the 4 counties or counties that are impacted to add the new voting centers. The county executive is going to be supporting the bill with the same amendment, and council staff, Amanda, you may want to speak more to this, but is recommending supporting with the same amendment as well.
Sorry, Councilmember Jawando, the names here have to be fixed, because on the other side, they're not right either. Jawando, and then Katz.
Katz, yeah. And then you have somebody else.
And then
Yeah,
Albornoz. Okay. All right, Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for the update. I just wanted to strongly support this amendment. I think we've had the opposite problem happening here, where we've had attempts to close down voting centers and sites in Montgomery County, and we fought those back. And I think the more we can have, the better. They are, depending on where you are in the county, some can be a little harder and further to get to. So I do support the amendment as well, as far as having the discretion here in the county, but I think my recommendation on the record would be that we would use these 2 extra sites. I think we could use it. The more people we have participating, the better. So I just wanted to thank you all for the work on this and just say I strongly support it.
Thank you, Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much. Does the Board of Elections have any idea where these sites might be?
Ms. Jurgensen, would you like to approach the table, please?
Margaret Jurgensen, Election Director, Montgomery County Board of Elections. No, sir.
Took you longer to say your name, Margaret, than, well, it did, and to Councilmember Joando's point, we all supported having the additional sites, but, I mean, we have to figure out where they would be and where the backups were from the early voting sites if we're going to do this, and so that we can give support in those areas. But I'm certainly supportive if we can figure out where they would be and when we could do them, you know. Has the Board of Elections at all discussed this?
Mr. Katz, the board plans to, I have not had first of all, the board does change in June, so, or may not change. I mean, that's
Right.
hours stronger or above me. But what we plan to do is in April, go over the calendar, but by the late October, the Board of Elections will need to make its recommendations. So in April, we will review what sites are available across the county and what sites have the electrical as well as the network capabilities. And then, as always, we will have a public hearing. We will begin the public discussion in July, and we will also have a public discussion in September.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Jurgensen, isn't this the process that the board has taken
Yes.
up
Yes.
before, correct? And so you
Correct.
do an extensive sort of evaluation, plus there's some determination made for areas that may not have, you know, as much access, et cetera. So I assume that would be the process that you would be engaged in, correct?
Yes, there's a legal process, and then there's Montgomery County specific issues.
Correct. Thank you so much. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is this working? Thank you, Madam President. I have personally seen what a great job our board does and the staff in putting together the logistics behind all of the challenges that come with having such a engaged electorate. I would point out that in 2 years, we're going to go through another presidential election cycle, and I suspect turnout will be higher than maybe it's ever been. I know personally about some of the parking challenges and struggles, and I also know some of the operating expenses that aren't covered in every spreadsheet. And so particularly the departments who absorb. So I would encourage my colleagues in the Fed committee as we ramp up and get ready for that particular election cycle, the Recreation Department in particular, looking at the revenue requirements that it has and maybe recommending that for those 2 weeks of early voting, that the revenue be forgiven that they would normally be required to receive as part of their operating budget, because I think we're going to have to clear out those buildings realistically to avoid some of the traffic challenges that we've had in the past. And I would also encourage us to look at more crossing guards in particular and more traffic coordination, because what's happening is the streets and neighborhoods immediately adjacent to the facilities are getting overrun and really frustrating residents in those communities. So having additional resources to address those issues, I think, will be important so that everybody has a positive experience when coming out and voting.
We can have a joint Fed committee to address that and be, kind of be thinking ahead. It's never easy. We've had lots of incredible work done trying, especially in Wheaton, trying to find alternative sites and things like that. But it is, I would add my appreciation for everything that goes into trying to figure all that out. Nonetheless, it is important, I think, for us to plan ahead.
Madam Chair,
yes.
On the spreadsheet that I put together, it says overtime, and I believe it says to be determined. Every election cycle, particularly at the general election, we are having a larger impact, a greater impact on the agencies that support us, and that is quite a few agencies. recreation, police, general services. And yes, I agree with Councilmember Gabe that
I like that.
that, yeah, we really need to look at these overall costs to the county as we go for, and you're right. Pew just put out a report that's talking about probably the largest voter turnout ever since the 1960, the Kennedy-Nixon election.
Incredible. Yes, Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. I don't want to belabor the points. I agree with everything that's been said and am supportive of anything that can increase participation in the process. The one area of the bill that I think wasn't mentioned is the hours discussed, right? I mean, are we looking at hours, and is there a Board of Elections viewpoint on that?
I apologize for sort of taking this for a moment, but it may, and then Margaret may have some addition. I just wanted to share with you that Delegate Lukey has shared with us that he's offering an amendment to take that part of the bill out because there's a separate bill by Delegate Alonzo Washington that's dealing with hours of operation. So it's expected that this bill will not deal with that. So I didn't mention it for that reason, but you're absolutely right, it's there.
Got it, because I think that's part of the process too. I mean, I appreciate the Mako amendment, which makes this less of an unfunded mandate and allows us the opportunity to provide for access to the ballot box for as many residents as possible. But the hours is a big piece of this as well. For working people, 10 o'clock is not a particularly convenient time to vote. And so I guess it would be a different vehicle, it sounds like, but there would be an impact on the county there. I was just curious as to if there was a Board of Elections view on the hours adjustments.
The current statute requires the board to conduct the presidential general election from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. Mr. Lukey's amendment would only address the general election for the gubernatorial, to change that from the 10 a.m. start time to the 8 a.m. start time. So, but as I heard the same thing, that Delegate Lutke is going to withdraw that portion of his amendment, or that portion of his bill.
And does the Board of Elections have any views on? Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I think I'm hearing no objection to the recommendation by our staff to support with the amendments that were suggested by Mako. Okay.
The next bill is the statewide expanded polystyrene food service product prohibition. Delegate Learman and Senator Kagan have put in similar bills for the last 3 years. And recall, the first year, we requested an amendment so that any local jurisdiction that had a law that was at least as stringent could continue their program as it was. That language is continued and is in this version of the bill as well. And this was done with, like I said, Delegate Learman and the City of Gaithersburg, Tacoma Park, and Prince George's County. Last year, the county executive and the county council both supported the bill. The county executive is supporting the bill again this year.
Okay, Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you, Council President. As the author of the county's legislation that we passed several years ago, I recommend that we support this state bill and maintaining the exception that we can have a more stringent version. Our law is not well known, but it does require all takeout foodware to be compostable, which affects straws. I don't know that it's been fully adopted across the sector yet, but we have already addressed an issue that many people may hear about because there's a lot of movement around the straw issue as well.
Okay, any objection to go with the staff recommendation? Nope. Okay, we agree. All right.
The next bill is the Clean Cars Act of 2019. And what this bill does is expand the excise tax credit that's used for plug-in electrical vehicles to include fuel cell electric cars. These are not widely available at this time. They're powered entirely by electricity that's produced combining hydrogen and oxygen, which runs the motor, thereby the vapors that come off are just water vapor. The maximum credit will be for $3,000, and there's a requirement in the bill that the Strategic Energy Investment Fund reimburse the credits for 2020 up to $6 million, but that's inclusive of both the electric vehicles and the fuel cell vehicles. The county executive is going to support the bill.
So I think it's a terrible name for the bill, though, the Clean Cars Act. I mean, really,
They're not looking at my car.
I understand, yeah, but
Ms. Wenger, did you have something that you wanted to add regarding this?
Yeah, it sounds like we did receive some correspondence from the environmental community, specifically the Sierra Club, that they had some issues with the fuel cell portion of the bill. I can't go into a lot of detail. I don't have a lot of detail on that. This information was also provided to the county executive, but he believed the bill on its face was still good as is, so.
Okay. My colleagues have any objection, I guess, then we will
yeah.
support. All right.
Okay, this next bill is what we know as the Fight for 15 bill, and it increases the state minimum wage over 5 years from $10.10 to $15. So between FY19 and FY24, it increases to $15. It also phases out the tip credit for tipped employees. So the current minimum wage for tipped employees is $3.63 at the state level. That gets phased out over 7 years, so that at the end of those, by FY 2027, tipped employees have a minimum wage of $15. The bill also, right now, there are a number of categories of agricultural workers and of processing, what's called first processing of agricultural produce and of seafood, folks that are involved in freezing, canning, et cetera. Those categories of employees are exempt from the state minimum wage, and under our county law are also exempt. We pulled in those state exemptions. This bill repeals those exemptions so that those categories of employees would be entitled to the state minimum wage. And it would also have a carryover effect to our county law, in that if it's higher, they're entitled to the county minimum wage. So there are some materials, if you have an interest in more information, I'd be happy to talk about them, but circles 4 through 7 have background information on both the county minimum wage and the state minimum wage. Last year, this bill is very similar to a bill from last year, except that last year's bill did not repeal the exemptions for those categories of employees I just mentioned. Last year, both the county executive and county council supported the bill, even though, as with this year, there are some slight differences in the phase-in for the $15 wage, and we could talk about that more specifically if you like, but there's some slight variations of the phase-in to 15. And last year, the decision was made by both the council and county exec that, support the state bill. It's a big enough issue, an important enough issue, support the state bill, and if necessary, come back and look at the county law and make adjustments as you wanted. So would be happy to talk, answer any questions.
Councilmember Friedson.
Oh, I should say that the county executive supports the bill.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess my only concern, I support the minimum wage. I think that now that we've passed the $15 minimum wage, having the state at the same level as us is critically important, not just for workers, but for businesses here as a competitiveness issue, and to make sure that we're all on the same page. I guess I have a few concerns about the idea of not, there are a lot of pain and effort from the prior council went into a carefully crafted bill, and I think our starting point should be that we think that our minimum wage is pretty good, and suggest that the state follow us with it. I think that should be our formal position. We don't know where this is going to end up, but my view would be, why would we support something that is different, I think in some material ways, different from what was passed for the county, and then react to that? We may ultimately have to do that in the end, but why wouldn't our initial advocacy position be support with amendments to comply, the spirit of it being a $15 minimum wage, which, is what we have, but comply with and be consistent with what our standards are. I mean, that would be the preferable situation for us from a public policy and consistency standpoint, I would think, unless I hear otherwise. And I guess the second piece of it is, the tip worker piece. I mean, there was a huge battle in DC, based specifically on the tip worker piece and this question of whether the workers wanted it or not. I don't have a strong position on that. I'd have to learn a little bit more on what specifically is happening here, but I have a feeling that there are going to be some significant changes to what this bill looks like as it goes through the process, and I wouldn't want to get ahead of, supporting individual aspects of this bill, some of which I think could be much more controversial than the overarching goal in terms of Fight for 15, which I support, and I think, there'd be a lot of support, I would presume, from my colleagues, 5 of whom were on the previous council that did a tremendous amount of work on this. So I'm concerned on both of those aspects of why our formal position wouldn't be to support it with amendments, and those amendments reflecting the current Montgomery County $15 minimum wage, which now our businesses are complying with and is helping our workers. And two, the question of whether there are individual aspects of this which are likely to be debated vociferously, I would imagine, where we've seen, particularly with neighboring jurisdictions in the region, where these are fairly controversial and there isn't unanimity in terms of the workers of whether or not this is a preferred provision.
So, very, very important questions, and I'll take a crack, and then I think Melanie might want to jump in because I think they're hugely political questions in the end. So the county's law is in some ways significantly different than this in this way. This bill applies to all employers. Our county law makes a distinction between large employers, mid-sized employers, small employers, and phases them in differently. So changing the bill to be that kind of, make those distinctions amongst employers at the outset would be different. To your point, this bill is seen as a starter. If you could see from this bill, the advocates put everything in here. So they've added, by taking out those exemptions for agricultural workers and for first processing folks, and also employees who work on commission, they've taken that out. That's something that wasn't there before, but they're putting it in. So substantively, it'd be different. Politically, it's a judgment call. Politically, and this was kind of discussed last year, do we support an effort that so many advocates and stakeholders have been working on for so many years and have pulled together a package they're putting in? Or do we come down and say, do it like we did? I think it's no surprise to anyone here that Montgomery County, we navigate something down in Annapolis. We navigate not making the rest of the state do what we want to do or have done all the time, and we navigate that because it's not viewed well in many circumstances. So, but again, I think Mel is probably better able to speak to the politics of it. But it's a very good question. It's a very it's an option to support the bill with amendments that would make it look like the county's bill.
I guess the follow-up, I appreciate all of those points. I guess the follow-up would be, there are going to be a lot of different groups for and against that are advocating for their positions, which I think is important. If our goal ultimately would be to get this as close to where we ended up as possible, what leverage do we have if our starting point for advocacy is submitting support in full without any mention of the fact that we have gone through a painstaking legislative process to get to a certain point and have stakeholder buy-in and, have gotten to the end of a legislative battle. I wasn't here. I didn't put in that work in that time. I don't have the black and blue marks to prove that I was part of that process, and I appreciate my colleagues who were, because I know it wasn't easy. I know this is not an easy issue to take on. It's very complicated. People view the minimum wage very differently. To one group, the minimum wage is a starting salary, that teaches young people who are just entering the workforce. To another group of people, they see the reality of who the average minimum wage worker is in the country, which is oftentimes a single mother of color who's middle-aged, which is a far different view of what the minimum wage means. So this is a very difficult and challenging issue to navigate, and to start at a point, I think, that is not the point where we ended. I think is just a tough place to be, because then we come in at the very end and, we've already supported the bill and everything in it. So, I mean, my view would be, if we're going to support it, support what we ultimately want.
One thing,
Oh, okay. I thought Melanie was gonna.
I would say that certainly we would be making the legislature aware of where the differences are and why those differences exist. So I think it is an issue for the body here if you absolutely would want to go in with support with amendments and change everything back, or allow what is going to be a very major negotiation. Because certainly the state chamber is going to go to the mats against a piece of legislation like this to work itself out. I mean, we are not preempted in the bill, and that is a very good thing, because, there's a group in Annapolis, some of them very powerful, of the majority party, that support preemption. And so I think it is of sorts a dance, and I think what you're raising is very legitimate, and I think it's something to think about. But there might also be other ways to send that message and potentially not show a 100% commitment to the bill as drafted.
Yeah, and I want to move to my other colleagues as well. I think that what Melanie has just described, at least for me, that's where I am. I have the black and blue marks to show how hard it was, but there is no doubt that this issue of preemption is one that we always discussed and we're worried about. At the same time, we want to, lead in terms of, the message that we appreciate and we stand for, finally, this moving forward. And I do worry about that delicate dance of Montgomery County trying to just go out there and kind of dictate how it should go, because they will go through this process. So I personally would rather us, support, and if anything, really strengthen or highlight that this preemption thing is something that, we want to keep over there. But knowing that this will probably end up in a different place seems to be a good strategy, but, we'll see where my colleagues are. Councilmember Rice?
Well, thank you very much, Madam President, and as another person who has the scars on the other side of this discussion and debate, it's one in which it's still equally concerning understanding from our restaurant industry in particular, who I've had the unique pleasure over the past year and a half of talking with folks who do have employees who do rotate between different jurisdictions where we have differing minimum wages and the challenges there. And a lot of our folks who are doing shift work, a lot of our folks who are working in construction and other kinds of things that are dancing between the different jurisdictions is creating a challenge. And so I do look forward to some sort of synergy when it comes to a consistent wage amongst all. That would make it easier for us. However, these nuanced differences actually are even more complicated than what they are currently. Currently, there's a set minimum wage, that's a state minimum wage, and what Montgomery County does. With these nuances would make it even harder for folks who are dealing with the current differences right now. I mean, they've been able to work into some of their formulas, how they do their paychecks. But I mean, I could only imagine a person who works in both the District of Columbia and in Montgomery County at a restaurant who is treated as a tipped minimum wage employer or employee in one sense, and then treated completely differently. And if you don't think that it happens very frequently. We just opened up a Yard House, and I know the general manager of Yard House is my cousin, and we have people who work at the location in downtown DC, as well as the one that just opened up in Gaithersburg. And so it's already created challenges for them, but to do it from a tipped worker perspective, my God, I could only imagine how crazy it would be. So it does behoove us to have this conversation because there really are some very dire consequences as a result of us not being on the same page. And I think that the point that Councilmember Friedson made about making sure that we're adamant about not upsetting the apple cart is incredibly important because it's the stability of our businesses. The reality is that DC is eating our lunch when it comes to the restaurant, bar, club scene. And so, I didn't mean to say that. And so from that perspective, I'm really concerned about the viability of our businesses and them being able to compete if, in fact, we layer on another sort of complication. And that's not to say, again, I think that we struck a good balance here in Montgomery County. I'm fine with what we did. That's the reason why I voted for it. But to have this layered on top of it, even not preempting us, is still a tremendous concern, and it's going to mean incredible complications for all kinds of businesses, especially our restaurants and other areas. So that's just my take. I think we need to be very cautious of this.
Councilmember Reamer.
Thanks. I just wanted to get clear. So some provisions of this bill would change policy in Montgomery County, the tip wage, the sectors of the economy where the minimum wage should not apply. But others would not. The schedule for when you get to 15, the business size, that kind of thing. Is that basically
Right, the actual minimum wage phase-ins, there's a sheet, there's actually, are almost the same with slight differences. If you look at Circle 6 of the packet, what you would see there is the phase-in for the county's minimum wage. And in actuality, there's not too many differences under the state bill.
This is the county's bill.
This is the county's. So if you think, essentially, the state is phasing up to 15 by July 1, 2023.
For all employers?
For all employers.
They don't have a tiering yet.
Right.
I say yet.
So if you just walked across, what you'd see is that for large employers, the county would already be at 15 the prior year. But it would be, in the year that the state gets to 15, for large employers, the 15 would be adjusted for inflation. So it'd be slightly different, all right? Because it got to 15 a year earlier.
But as proposed, does it overrule ours or does it not?
As long as ours is higher,
As long as ours is high.
ours applies.
So if they were to make theirs more aggressive, if they didn't have tiers, if they said all employers are on the same schedule, then that would,
As long as that's,
then ours would not be stricter, ours would be less strict.
as long as that schedule was stricter than the 3 phase-ins you have here, right?
So it'll be
As long as
complicated.
it's higher, if it was higher, the state minimum wage would apply.
Interesting.
Yeah. So what you've got is, so for the mid-size employers, you get to 15 in the same year.
Mid-size.
And for your small employers, interestingly, the state minimum wage is higher because it kicks in on July 1, 2023 for FY '24. So for the small employer,
hodgepodge.
you've got
Wherever it's
the minimum
stricter.
wage, state minimum wage is getting there quicker.
Wow.
For your mid-size, it's essentially the same. And for your large employers, they get there a year earlier.
So there's not a wholesale carve-out that says if you've already got your own, yours is good. It just,
It's under state law right now and case law, a more generous local minimum wage. For the employee applies,
so it does overrule us for the most part as proposed,
unless we're more generous.
unless we're more generous, which is only the case in one tier of employer. Interesting. Well, I do think that we ought to just watch this and generally be supportive. I don't think where this ends up is where it started. So it's no point in getting too, fixated on what the details are today, and we can just keep talking about it and encourage the state to pass to fight for 15.
Councilmember Glass?
Thank you, Madam President. I share the sentiment that Councilmember Reamer just said of being supportive and recognizing that this will change over the legislative session in some form or fashion. But I also want to note that this will end up being a benefit for the county in terms of our operating budget. Because just last week, the Health and Human Services Committee, we had a meeting about additional support for the developmental disabled community and the ADD community and other social service providers who rely on the county to make up the delta between what the current minimum wage is or between what they're able to pay their employees and the increasing minimum wage that's here. And so as the floor rises here in the state, that delta will be minimized, which will benefit the county in terms of our budget. That notwithstanding the other societal benefits that come along with increasing the minimum wage, but I just want to note that. And while there was a fiscal note related to the last bill or two bills before regarding the expansion of early voting sites, has anyone prepared kind of what that number is regarding what some of those funds to the social service community is?
I do have that. I'll pull it up in my email, and we can pick that up in a second when I pull it up.
Great, thank you. That's it.
Okay, Councilmember Jawando?
Thank you, Council President. I just want to strongly suggest that we support the bill as is. The fight for 15 is an important fight. And in the richest county, in the richest state, in the richest country on the face of the earth, if you make $15 an hour and work 40 hours a week, you're still making under $30,000 a year in Montgomery County. So if we have to be more generous, I'd love to be in the position of the state coming up to where we are, and then we should still be more generous because we are the wealthiest and the highest cost of living county in the state. So I think for all those reasons, it's important for us to support this symbolically. We'll see where it comes out in the end, and we can make adjustments accordingly. But I just wanted to say that and urge my colleagues to do that as well.
Thank you, Vice President Katz.
Thank you, Madam President. So from what I have read, and I know that this is going to change many, many times before anything is done, but from what I've read, that they are asked, that there is some consideration where they would do this by region, that there would be, I mean, because the cost of living in Cumberland is certainly different than the cost of living in Montgomery County. So my only concern with supporting it as we're talking about it is that would we say we would support it as it is, and then once amendments start to flow in, because they will, then we would come back and revisit this, because we might not agree with all the amendments.
We could certainly bring amendments back as they come up. You're absolutely right that the regional approach is one of the approaches out there that we expect some stakeholders to speak to. We could bring back amendments and make sure we understand your position as they go along. I can just share with you that the one approach you did take last year, and I apologize if it's repetitive, is that you did note there were differences. We did note in the position statement, as Mel said, that there are differences, and this is what's happening in Montgomery County. And then just indicated that the state bill and the county law share the goal of the 15 minimum wage rate and supported the bill. But you're absolutely right, Councilmember Katz. That's one of the issues that'll come up among many. And, you know, if it helps, we could certainly provide updates throughout.
This is a major piece of legislation, and I believe it will pass. So we're here almost every week.
Yeah.
So we're going to let you know. I mean, that's what we do. We're going to let you know exactly what's going on with this piece of legislation, and you, of course, have the right to change things along the way, and we will convey those thoughts. So.
Thank you.
Is your light on?
And
Albert knows.
I don't know if Leslie had the information.
Go ahead, Leslie. And then
The savings, if you will, starting in the first year of the bill, when it becomes effective, would be about $2.5 million, and then the out years going up to $9 million over what the county is projected to spend on that supplement. If I may, I would point out, though, that as right now, the county's minimum wage is higher, and then we do have the supplement to get to 125 of the county's minimum wage. But as other neighboring jurisdictions, their minimum wage increases, that differential will only be 25% over the statewide minimum wage, not the additional county bump.
Thank you. Certainly agree with the consensus of my colleagues. It sounds like to support in principle. And I echo Councilmember Glass's comments regarding the impact on our disability community, which will be a great benefit across our region, but in particular Montgomery County. I am concerned about the waiter and waitress component, the tip wage component of DC. I feel strongly about that specific issue. And so I think it sounds like we covered in our language some wiggle room so that we revisit as amendments are made on specific issues, and certainly respect and understand the strategy of including everything in the kitchen sink as a starting point. But that, I just want to go on the record as saying that specific line item is one that I'm particularly interested in and look forward to discussing as we go on with this. Thank you.
I think we would definitely, particularly in light of this discussion, beef up our last year's position statement to reflect really the tipped employee issue and others, and the concern about the extent that, you know, there are differences, there are negative impacts, and to the extent that there can be consistency, that's a good thing.
I mean, I think that we do have that position from last time that did allude to some of the concerns that we might have. I mean, I think that what you just heard here is that we, support it in principle. I think the general language that we included is important. We're going to be back to talk about very specific things. So I personally think, what we've done in the past is sufficient to signal that there are going to be certain amendments that we're going to watch very closely and or advocate for without being too prescriptive. So I don't know if that is something that my colleagues can support. That's what we would like to signal.
Okay, and I would also note too, when the Department of Legislative Services goes to do a fiscal note on this, I'd be quite certain in the background section, they will discuss Montgomery County's system that it's put in place. And if it's deficient in any way, we will work to ensure that it's explained in the position statement.
Great, thank you. All right, next one. I know,
Next
right?
bill is House Bill 257, Civil Actions Immunities Donated Food. This was on the list at suggestion of County Council staff. This bill would limit the civil liability of a nonprofit if they serve or prepare donated food. Currently in law, this protection is extended to individuals who serve or prepare donated food, and this would extend it to nonprofits.
Absolutely, let's approve it.
Okay, no objection, we approve.
So this next bill is a bi-county bill. I know Councilmember Hucker had an interest in it, and
I do have some remarks that he sent because he's sick at home, so I'll read those after you describe it.
Sure. So right now, WSSC has 4 bargaining units. One of them is the Office and Technical Unit. This bill would create 5 bargaining units by splitting off the Office and Technical. I know WSSC staff are here, I think. Yes, WSSC staff are here if you'd like to speak to them. But essentially, it's my understanding that the members of the technical unit have enough support within that cadre to form a union, but with the larger group, they don't. But it's my understanding that the Teamsters have been speaking with WSSC management, that the general manager supports the bill, county executive supports the bill. The commission has not met since this late filed bill was introduced, so there's not formally a commission position yet.
I think what you just described is what Councilmember Hucker wanted to communicate, that he has consulted with WSSC meter readers, Teamster Local 730, and WSSC before bringing this issue to Delegate Kramer's attention to draft the bill. And although WSSC doesn't have a formal position yet, he says that the general manager is recommending support of the legislation to the WSSC commissioners, and he says that he really urges us to vote in favor. If somebody's here from WSSC can approach Justin. Do you have anything to add?
Good afternoon, Madam President. Guy Andes, Government Relations Manager for WSSC. The comments that you made are appropriate. While the commissioners have not taken a formal position on this bill, they do meet 2 weeks from Wednesday, if not sooner, if a special session is called. The general manager will be making a recommendation to the full commission of supporting this bill as it's drafted. We're here to answer any questions. I have Amanda Kahn, our general counsel, to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, so what is the read of my colleagues? Support?
Yeah,
Let's go with that objection. I think we all are in favor of supporting. Thank you so much for being here.
So we should not water down the bill.
We should not water down the position, is what Councilman Vice President Katz said.
But Councilman Katz.
I mean, he always beats us to it. Okay, so with that, I think that we are adjourned,
Until
correct?
next week, right.
Yep.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay,
Give us an update, please, on 5G.
okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is the Senate filing deadline, so what we will expect to see is 2 pieces of legislation. There will be something called the Community Coalition Bill, and that is a bill that is the kind of the MACO MML bill. Of sorts, it addresses only the right-of-way. It does not codify anything in the FCC ruling. What I would describe it as it is of sorts a template for a local subdivision, a municipality, or a county that kind of does not move forward with putting a process in place to work through applications that it might receive for broadband infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you say only the right-of-way, because that's kind of where the whole battle is, if I understand.
It is where the whole battle is,
Okay.
but what it doesn't do is allow, it does not address the issue of public assets, buildings, things like that. Okay, and again, these bills will be out hopefully tonight, and I'll send them on to you. That is entirely different than the industry bill. The industry bill is very, very similar to what we discussed last year.
Okay.
It does, there were meetings throughout the summer and into the fall with MACO and MML and the industry to see if there could be some common ground found. At the end of the day, that was not possible.
Right.
And so the bills are exceedingly different, and the industry bill is drafted to the local government article. The MACO MML bill is drafted to business regulation, and the MACO MML bill also includes things that a local subdivision would want, including the ability to impose franchise fees, including the creation of a fund that could be used to further expand broadband deployment in underserved areas. So needless to say, they are very different pieces of
Right.
legislation.
So just, we should take this up in full.
Oh, we will.
At a future council session.
As soon as the bills are in, we'll bring them out to you and talk more fully about them.
Okay, terrific. Needless to say, for those who were concerned about neighborhood impacts, they are far worse under the industry-favored bill, and the industry is moving ahead, and they have support in Annapolis with many prominent committee members introducing this bill. Hopefully, the community coalition thing has some traction too. We'll find out more as we go.
We will be competitive.
So if okay, we'll take it up soon.
All right.
Thank you.
Anybody else with their lights on? 'Cause- nope. All right, with that, we're adjourned. Thank you so much.